Anyway, so while you were out, I asked a couple of the audience members had questions. One of them asked if Priti Patel was what you thought of her running for prime minister, and if you thought that was really going to happen, and what the response would be.
Well, I mean, I think that it does seem inconceivable. I mean, she has negligible public support. I think actually people are quite afraid of her, and quite rightly. She's a terrifying human being. I mean, she has announced her candidacy, but maybe more importantly, the emails that the Grey Zone has reported on note that as far back as kind of February this year, Richard Dearlove, who I mentioned is the kind of the head of this, the former MI6 chief and head of this really disturbing right-wing intelligence cabal, thought was in private emails about how Patel was running a leadership campaign behind the scenes. This is very interesting because she was seen as a kind of arch Johnson loyalist. I mean, I mean, she has an absolutely, I mean, she's pro-capital punishment, which is just anathema in the UK. It's just not an issue on, up for discussion for the overwhelming majority of people. She was fired for lying because she conducted secret trips to Israel on behalf that were funded by a key Israeli lobbyist, and tried to, I mean, and if you can even believe it, while she was there, she visited areas of the Golan Heights, which is of course illegally occupied by Israel, where Israel provides aid to ISIS fighters. And she was so taken by what they were doing that when she got back to Britain, she specifically requested that UK aid be provided to these medical shelters. This is, I mean, again, this is contrary to British convention and law that they do not provide aid and funding to areas that Israel illegally occupies. So yeah, I mean, it is very frightening. I think that she is running on. I think that she's the only candidate so far who's running on a very hard Brexit platform, and I think that could give her an edge, because other candidates, because they know it's been a total mess, have been somewhat silent on this, and they said that just one of the reasons I think, as I said, that Johnson was forced to go was that he announced in late 2020 that he'd crafted this quote unquote oven ready Brexit deal, but then actually it's becoming increasingly clear that a lot of it is unworkable. A lot of the rules as well haven't been enforced, so there are effective restriction. All imports coming from Europe are meant to be subject to extensive checks now. There's no kind of free movement of goods anymore. But this hasn't been enforced because it would create an enormous backlog and it would lead to empty shelves. Although we've got quite a few of them already anyway in the UK.
Yeah, we do.
So yeah, I mean, I think that yes, it is frightening. She quite clearly, I mean, one member of the cabal, this individual called Gwyddian Prince, met with her in secret in order to get her kind of blessing and the Home Office imprimatur on a counter intelligence operation targeting Green activists and lobbyists, in which he advocated trying to dig up sexual dirt on these people and attempt to expose them as Chinese agents of influence. I mean, it's insane stuff. But like, he was very, very taken. I mean, he's certifiably insane, Prince, and I mean, he at one stage advocated pimping out his own daughter in order to get close to Boris Johnson and try and influence his policies as a result. And he was very taken with Patel and said that she was a refreshing change from the current soggy mass of politicians. So quite clearly, she does have backing behind the scenes. I mean, again, as happened with Boris, if she gets in and doesn't deliver these people what they want, which I think is probably impossible and unworkable, then they will turn on her and look elsewhere.
And at the same time, you have this, and this isn't off the subject, I'm just trying to loop it in because I'm personally curious about this as well. But you have Ireland kind of taking a position about what's going on, right? Ireland, and they might become unified as a result of all this. What are your thoughts on that, and what is really happening behind the scenes there with Sinn Féin?
Well, I mean, I think it's yes. I mean, Sinn Féin early this year won an absolutely unprecedented victory. And I think that yes, that Northern Ireland was a classic example of a very obvious problem that would be created by Brexit that no one's talked about, and indeed and of which pro-Brexit politicians were completely ignorant. This is effectively been borderless with Ireland since the since the late 90s with the Good Friday Agreement. And yes, that also, you know, and that's been that's healed a lot of very, you know, kind of open old wounds related to the troubles, the kind of the extensive, you know, intelligence and indeed brutal intelligence war that was fought from the kind of the late 60s onwards, and, you know, targeted Northern Ireland's Catholic population primarily. And so, I mean, it's apt as well that Patel's running as this quote unquote authentic Brexiteer. I mean, she's previously advocated quite seriously in public, trying to starve Ireland of imports in order to get them to back down over issues related to the kind of the Northern Ireland border. I mean, you know, that is quite clearly a reference to the British created Irish potato famine, which, you know, on top of being extremely tasteless, I think it upset and angered an enormous number of people at the time. So yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and I think that yes, increasingly, you know, the UK is collapsing at a rate of knots. I mean, you know, the Brexit has emboldened the Scottish nationalists. They've now, after some years of heel dragging, have said that they will, in 2023 at the absolute latest, hold yet another referendum on Scottish independence. I think that would win by a landslide, probably. The Welsh Assembly, which is, you know, it's not quite a parliament or a government of Wales, is calling for more powers. There's there's rising levels of support for secession from the UK. So yeah, I mean, you know, England, the British Empire might at last just be reduced to England, rather sorry kind of state of affairs. So yeah, I think that this is created an enormous number of unforeseen problems because people don't actually have their eye on the ball. And I mean, I think as well that you see this with the war in Ukraine as well, where it's like the basic proposition, the kind of the assumption underlying these the sanctions that were placed on Russia was just, it was contradictory and flawed that anyone sensible could see this. What the argument was, okay, so we're going to make Russia's exports more expensive and harder to get. Therefore, this will harm Russia. Well, you know, Europe is, I mean, to varying degrees, but particularly like in the West, is so utterly dependent on Russian energy that any disruption to access or rise in cost will not only be absolutely disastrous, but of course it's going to massively enrich Russia. That's why Russia has one of the best performing economies in the world currently. It's, you know, the ruble is back to levels not seen for almost a decade. And so I think people just were not thinking about the consequences, and we're just pushing ahead with this stuff without any real, you know, like clear understanding or consideration of what happens if it all goes wrong. I mean, you know, if you look at you can look at, you know, kind of heat maps of this across Europe. Most countries are facing double-digit inflation. Most are facing recession. In Germany, which has had a trade surplus for over 30 years. Since unification, that has ceased to be. It is an ex-trade surplus, and then you know the response is not, okay, well actually maybe we should rethink this. It's doubled down even further, and genuinely, I mean, I think, you know, we're seeing the images, and the quite incredible images in Sri Lanka of hordes of people storming the presidential palace, and then watching news reports about this happening from the rather lavish president's, you know, now former president's office. Like, I really wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing more and more of this across Europe, because people are angry, and you know, it's like you see it in the US. I mean, I think that the Democrats were on course for, you know, a brutal pasting in November this year anyway, as it is. And I don't think the argument that, oh right, well the reason that, you know, the reason that you can't afford to eat is because of Putin is going to cut through, but not when you have untold hundreds of millions and billions in totally unaccountable weaponry reaching Ukraine. No idea where it's actually being used, what it's, you know, where it's going. You know, there are reports that you can find online, reports of weaponry being, you know, sold by the Ukrainians to the Russians, which is just completely insane, and being sold on the dark web. And it's like, you know, that this is, again, the US government is doubling down on a policy of just, you know, at all costs, just keep on rearming Ukraine and allow them to like limp on. And it's like, you know, I understand the kind of desire to, you know, to help, you know, another country in that situation, but it's like, I think it's just getting to the point now where, yes, they're conscripting women. Troops are effectively, what troops remain are effectively cannon fodder. Numerous battalions and troop contingents are refusing to fight because they have no support, and it's a suicide mission. And it's just like, I mean, really just is continuing to maintain and endure this conflict, which is completely unwinnable. From Ukraine's perspective, like, I mean, is that actually not hurting them more than it's helping? But no, there's zero consideration of this.
But yet you have some world leaders that have really been enriched by this war, like Boris Johnson personally and his family, correct? And that's what some of the corruption is about.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I think as well that it's been there was an enterprising journalist in the UK wrote a rather amusing article which tracked how it tracked how whenever Johnson was in trouble or there was a scandal in the newspapers, he would fly to Kiev, or he would get Zelensky on the phone and then publicize this widely. And I mean, you see it with Macron, where he's published so many pictures of himself, a la Zelensky, wearing, jeans and a t-shirt and whatnot. Like lots of politicians are trying to jump on this bandwagon for their own purposes. But then it's like, again, people are starting the narrative's starting to crack. I mean,
yes.
And indeed, yes, that like it's actually becoming somewhat a poison chalice to be so intimately connected to this conflict. I mean, Liz Truss, she's someone who the cabal talk about as a potential Johnson replacement, although they refer to her as being quote unquote not particularly loyal, which is interesting. You see who's secretly actually running everything behind the scenes here.
Yeah.
And so Liz Truss has said that she will effectively back direct British intervention in the war, which is, I mean, that's World War III stuff.
Yeah.
It's completely insane, but it's like, as is so often the case with with this stuff, it's an attempt to out-hawk. It's a desperate attempt to out-hawk each other. But then whoever comes out top in that contest is going to have to back that up with actions. And any major British involvement in the conflict is going to end absolutely terribly and have really adverse consequences for the entire world. It's lunacy, and like I say, I mean, I part of me thinks that this could well be over by autumn, and yes, I think that's going to boomerang badly on whoever wins.
I want to believe that it'll be over by autumn, but I'll be honest. I mean, I think that they're making so much money, weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, and these are American companies, Raytheon with British ties though, and other, weapon manufacturers, and of course there's British companies making money too off of this, but with such an incentive where their profits have literally quadrupled and quadrupled in 90 days, 120 days, how do we end this before September? Because no one is discussing diplomatic inroads or diplomacy. All they're talking about is escalation of weaponry and wars and giving Vladimir Putin and the Russian delegation cold shoulders to not even have discussions. So, I mean, I guess for our audience, there's been a lot of discussion that we might be getting marched to, unwillingly to World War III, a global conflict. Do you see that happening, or do you really think that there's some way that this can all end in the fall? And how would that look? How do we get there?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things I've found interesting, but also quite disturbing, is that where I am in the world right now is the former Yugoslavia, which is there's that famous Churchill quote, which is the Balkans create more history than they can consume. What's interesting is that there has been an upsurge in the Western troop deployments to Bosnia, and before the conflict in Ukraine started, there were numerous NATO officials who were specifically talking, saying that, like, oh well, just like Ukraine, Bosnia has a right to choose its security arrangements, i.e., is free to join NATO. And that's at a time when the issue of Ukraine's NATO membership was such a sensitive flashpoint. I think it was very clear that this was being talked up as another potential theatre, or kind of another stick to prod the bear with, as so to speak. And I think that yes, that there is now an enormous number of British and German troops stationed in Bosnia. The calls for it to join NATO have intensified. There is talk, just as a brief bit of history, Bosnia is effectively two or even three countries that's wedged into one. There is the kind of unofficial state in its borders, which is the Republika Srpska, which is the Serb majority area, where there is an enormous amount of affinity for Russia. They're seen as a kind of a protector that's preventing their country and their culture being subsumed. And the support for joining NATO is literally 2% of the population in the last poll. So I mean, I think that it's certainly something to watch out for. I think that there is an increasing acknowledgement that actually this is going really badly and that this is unwinnable. I mean, several senior, current and former military officials, which again this has gotten no traction in the media, who've said that yes, that Ukraine is losing and badly, and that we need to rethink these things. I mean, I think that yes, that from the safety of Washington, which is effectively uninvadable, and the most heavy, it's all well and good to particularly when you're raking in money from major defense contractors, and they are funding your election campaigns. It's very easy say, oh right, well yes, let's just send even more rockets, even more kind of missiles, and maybe even some tanks and some jets into the mix, because hey ho, what have we got to lose? I mean, I do think that there is the prospect that Ukraine could just collapse. I mean, their economy is non-existent now. I mean, particularly the loss of the Donbass is that's about 50% of their GDP gone as it is. It's where the major mines and the resources are. And so yeah, I mean, it literally could just be the case that they just collapse. But then equally, yes, there are enough people who have a vested interest in keeping this going, who might find some way to extend it, might find some way to grow it in other regions. And I think that there was the Serbian president made a speech the other day where he talked about how Kosovo, which is another area, which is another kind of potential flashpoint. He stated that he had reason to believe that there was going to be an attack on the Serb minority in the north of the kind of largely unrecognized country of Kosovo, starting in October. So again, that's another thing to look out for. And again, that's a part of the world where Russia has enormous levels of support. I've traveled around northern Kosovo. There's pro-Russia, pro-Putin graffiti and posters everywhere, and they are seen as yes, a kind of protector of Serb sovereignty and rights in the country. I mean, so yes, I mean, things have the potential to get very, very, very messy indeed. I mean, another potential ray of sunshine, even though it's awful, is yes, I think internal social, economic, and political upheaval in established countries. I mean, yes, Johnson's no doubt in large part gone, or at least to a certain extent, what precipitated his downfall was the fact that yes, there's 10% inflation, which is getting higher all the time. Energy bills are through the absolute roof. People are having to choose between eating and heating. There are newspapers are publishing guides to how children can be fed for free or at least cheaply over the summer. I mean, this is, I mean, in an alleged first, one of the allegedly richest countries in the world. I think things could get really, really, really messy. And in that context, the war in Ukraine is going to be kind of off the agenda. Or yes, the Western support will simply collapse. There was a report in the FT earlier today about how amazingly the West is running out of ammunition to send to Ukraine. I mean, whoever thought that? So it's like let's wait and see. I mean, I think that the example that I always use is the Berlin Wall fell by accident, right? So it's like on the morning that it fell, the heads of the two Germanys met and discussed how by the year 2000 there would be limited free movement between the two Germanys. 24 hours later, East Germany had effectively ceased to exist as a state, and there was no border. So, often things can happen by happenstance, or just yes, or to quote Trotsky, war is what oils the wheels of revolution. I mean, I think the next few months are certainly going to be very interesting, although yes, I do worry, and I'm glad that there are mountains in easy reach for me here.
Yes.